Right now, somewhere in your brain, a region you are not consciously thinking about is quietly regulating your breathing, monitoring your surroundings, and processing what you read in the last few seconds. You did not ask it to. You did not turn it on. It simply never stopped. You have probably heard the claim that humans use only 10% of their brains. Maybe a teacher mentioned it. Maybe you saw it in a movie. Or maybe someone presented it as a well-known fact. It can sound almost believable because it leaves room for a comforting idea that there is a massive, untapped version of you just waiting to be unlocked. But neuroscience does not support that idea. By the end of this video, you will understand why and what is happening inside your brain right now that is far more interesting than the myth. Here are 10 facts that replace the 10% story with something supported by evidence. Stay for the final one because it changes the question you should ask about improving your mind. Start with the number itself. The claim that you use only 10% of your brain is unsupported by modern neuroscience. The reason it has survived for so long may be connected to how it spread. The misconception is often linked to misinterpretations of early neurological research or to statements attributed to psychologist William James. James discussed the idea that people fail to develop all their mental potential, but he did not establish that 90% of the physical brain remains unused. The claim was repeated until it began to feel true. That is how many neuromyths survive. The most direct way to investigate a claim about brain activity is to examine the brain. Modern researchers can do that. Imaging techniques such as positron emission tomography, or PET, and functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, allow researchers to study patterns related to brain activity. These techniques reveal activity across many regions during simple tasks, such as looking at pictures, and during more demanding tasks, such as reading or solving a problem. Researchers have found no evidence that 90% of a healthy brain remains permanently idle. The 10% claim does not merely underestimate how much brain tissue matters. It also misunderstands what brain activity means. Knowing the myth is wrong is one thing. Understanding what is happening is another. Brain scans show activity continuing across the brain, whatever you are doing. Some regions become more active than others at a given moment, but researchers have found no evidence that 90% of a healthy brain remains permanently unused. Think about that for a moment. Even when you are sitting still, your brain is not completely quiet. Resting state research has revealed organized patterns of ongoing brain activity when participants are not performing a demanding external task. Rest is therefore not the same as neurological inactivity. Your brain does not have a simple on and off switch. It maintains a baseline. That baseline is metabolically expensive. This fact becomes especially important when considering the 10% myth. The adult brain represents approximately 2% of total body weight, yet it accounts for around 20% of the body's oxygen and energy consumption at rest. The brain's work, including processing information, transmitting signals, and maintaining cells, requires a substantial and relatively steady supply of energy. Now consider what that means for the myth. Maintaining brain tissue is metabolically expensive, which is difficult to reconcile with the claim that most of it permanently does nothing. The brain's large energy demands are another reason the idea of a dormant 90% is implausible. A large share of the brain's energy supports signaling and information processing. The rest supports essential work, such as maintaining cells, restoring chemical balances, and keeping neural systems ready to respond. Your brain is continually working, and much of that work happens without entering conscious awareness. Now consider one of the strongest arguments against the 10% idea. What happens when brain tissue is injured? Neurologist Barry Gordon has noted that people use virtually every part of the brain, with much of it active across ordinary life. Neuroscientist Barry Beierstein also argued that if only 10% were normally used, damage to the remaining tissue should often produce no impairment. Clinical evidence does not show a vast reserve of consequence-free brain tissue. Damage to relatively small and specific regions can affect speech, movement, memory, perception, emotional regulation, or the ability to recognize familiar objects and people. The exact effect depends on the location, severity, and circumstances of the injury. This injury evidence is difficult to reconcile with the idea that 90% of the brain is useless. The brain is not filled with empty space. Its regions contribute to different functions and networks. If virtually the entire brain matters, why do different tasks appear to use different parts? The answer reveals something important about how the brain is organized. The brain uses certain regions more intensely during particular tasks. That does not mean every other region becomes completely inactive. When you walk, some muscles contribute more than others. Your brain also distributes work according to what the moment requires. Different regions have specialized roles. Networks involved in vision, hearing, movement, language, memory, and emotion change their activity according to what you are doing. When you read, language and visual systems become especially important. When you navigate, spatial processing networks contribute more. The senses can also influence one another. Under some experimental conditions, demanding visual processing is associated with reduced activity in auditory regions. Under other conditions, related sights and sounds can enhance processing together. The effect depends on attention, task demands, and whether the information is helpful or distracting. The brain is therefore not simply switching large sections on and off. It is continually changing the balance of activity across interconnected systems. This leads to another misunderstanding. Some people hear that virtually the whole brain is used and imagine that more activation must produce better thinking. If every region could operate at full intensity simultaneously, perhaps you would become smarter, faster, and more capable. That is not how efficient brain function works. Seizures involve abnormal electrical activity across brain networks. Synchronization can be involved, but seizure activity is more complex than every neuron simply firing together. Researchers have observed changing patterns of synchronization and desynchronization during different stages of seizure activity. Abnormal activation across brain networks is not a superpower. It can become a medical emergency. Efficient brain function is not about maximum activation. It depends on coordination, the appropriate regions operating at the appropriate time and in an effective sequence. What does that mean for you personally? You are not sitting on a dormant 90% waiting to be unlocked. But your brain can change. Its networks reorganize in response to experience, learning, injury, and repeated practice. Learning a new language or repeatedly practicing a demanding new skill can produce measurable changes in how brain networks operate and communicate. That is not unlocking unused brain tissue. It is reshaping patterns within the brain you already have. The brain's plasticity can be remarkable. In selected children who undergo major surgery for severe epilepsy, the remaining brain can reorganize some important functions. However, recovery varies, and significant difficulties can remain. These cases demonstrate both the brain's adaptability and the limits of that adaptability. That is a more accurate story. Your brain is not an underused machine. It is an adaptive biological system. And what happens during sleep? Your brain remains active during sleep, regulating essential functions and moving through different patterns of activity. Sleep also supports memory consolidation, while researchers continue studying its role in removing metabolic waste. Your brain does not completely switch off when you sleep. It changes what it is doing. Here is the final fact, the one that changes how you should think about your potential. The most useful question was never, how can you use more of your brain? A better question is, how can you use your brain more effectively? The answer is not a secret percentage, a pill, or a shortcut. Modern neuroscience indicates that virtually every part of a healthy brain contributes across different cognitive and physiological tasks over time. The goal is not maximum activation. It is developing more effective patterns, strengthening relevant skills through practice, building useful habits, and giving your brain the conditions it needs to operate well. You started this video with the number 10%. Now, the answer is clearer. You use virtually all of your brain over time, but not every region at maximum intensity at the same moment. Different regions become more or less active as your needs change, and the brain remains capable of adapting. If the way your brain forms habits interests you, watch the next video about how repeated behavior becomes increasingly automatic. It connects directly to what you have just learned. For more calm, evidence-based videos about neuroscience, psychology, habits, and human behavior, subscribe to The Behavior Blueprint. Which part surprised you most? The brain's energy demands, the evidence from injuries, or the explanation involving seizures? Share your answer in the comments.